Well, thank you for that very kind introduction and short introduction. My goodness, I can see the light. I can't see much else, but you'll have to let me know if you can hear me in the back of the room, because I can't see you in the back of the room. Bringing America Back to Life, I've been here before at the invitation of Molly Smith. This is a great conference, and I'm glad to be here again. And I just want to say my hat's off to Molly and the whole crew for organizing this wonderful event in these challenging times. Yeah. So I'm going to have to confess that I got on the Trump train back in I don't know, May of 2016. A number of us were invited up to New York City to meet with the now president, then candidate, and he told us he would appoint good judges to the federal bench and to the Supreme Court. He told us he would put in place a New Mexico City policy. He told us that he would do other things to protect life and family in the United States. And so I signed on. I joined the Catholic Advisory Group for the campaign. Got on the Trump train, as I say. There were plenty of seats. Yeah, and it got even emptier in October after the various hit pieces came out on him. But you know what I told people at the time? I said, you know, he's the first president since Teddy Roosevelt to have 5 children. I said, you know, it's been a long time since we've had a president with a large family. Unfortunately, they're not all by the same woman, but he does have a wonderful family, and he's done wonderful things for the pro-life movement over the last few years, and we're hoping, I think, for many more. Now, I'm going to talk today about the fact that the left has told us that we in the pro-life movement are entirely wrong. We're wrong for many reasons, of course. They believe we're wrong because they don't believe that human life begins at conception, as we do. They don't believe that there should be any limits on abortion at all. In fact, they believe that children can be killed after birth. They do that in China. We shouldn't be doing that in our own country. They also believe that our tax dollars should be used to support abortion around the world because, after all, they believe that the world has an overpopulation problem. One of the leaders of what they call the Squad, actually I call them the gang, after the Gang of Four in China, but is AOC, who has the distinction of having an acronym for a name. Actually, her full name is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. My children, who are now mostly adults and who have left home, they eventually do leave, of course, have a nickname for her. They call her Alexandria Occasional Cortex. Now, they came up with that entirely on their own. I was so proud. So, what does AOC believe now about the future? She says she's afraid to have children because of climate change. Well, I see we've got a fan back in the back. So AOC is actually, you know, kind of a voice from the past, because I'm old enough to remember back in 1968 when the valedictorian of Yale University got up, a young woman, and with tears in her eyes said, because of overpopulation, the socially responsible thing to do is not have children. I'm not going to have any children. She was crying as she said that. The difference is 52 years later that I don't think AOC was crying. But I can't figure out why she's afraid to have children. I mean, is it because she thinks the world is ending in 12 years? She said that too. Is it because she thinks that children are little carbon emitters who, by their very existence, pollute the atmosphere? She said that too. But she's also said that she doesn't want to bring up children in a world that's going to turn into planet Krypton in 50 years. So I'm not sure exactly what her reasoning is here. But the left is increasingly irrational when it comes to a lot of things. You know, I thought that we were the ones who were supposed to be standing on street corners wearing sackcloth and ashes saying the end is near. But the other side has taken that over. But they don't do it very well, do they? Because we say the end is near because we know that after this end there's a new beginning and we're going to live in a better world. They say the end is near because they think that planet Earth is going to be incinerated in 10 or 20 years and that there'll be nothing left. I mean, that's a much harder sell, it seems to me. So we've got not just AOC, of course, we've got all of the candidates on the left. Actually, there aren't very many anymore. But we've got Bernie Sanders, for example. Bernie Sanders, who is not only goes around peddling failed socialist ideas that are better at producing tyranny than producing prosperity, you know, now he too is recycling the long discredited idea that we are breeding ourselves off the face of the planet. I mean, how you can still promote economic policies that have killed hundreds of millions of people over the last century is beyond me, unless you don't read history at all. I was in China. I heard from the Chinese people themselves how many people had died at the hands of Chairman Mao's Red Guards and at the hands of the Red Army earlier during the land reform. But I guess that, you know, for me it wasn't a honeymoon in the People's Republic of China. For him it was a honeymoon in the Soviet Union. Some of you may remember that former country that no longer exists. So, even the New York Times, back in the year 2000, in its millennial edition, listed 10 myths of the 20th century. And among the myths of the 20th century, from the New York Times, mind you, was the myth of overpopulation, because it is a myth. The truth is that birth rates are falling everywhere. Many countries are literally dying, filling more coffins than cradles each year. The maternity wards in Germany, the places where women used to go to give birth, are being turned into geriatric clinics. Many more countries will soon follow these countries into decline and depopulation. You know, even populous China now has one foot in the grave. And you might say to yourself, how can you take the most populous country in the world with 1.3 billion people and destroy its future? Well, if you want to do that, you have to embark on something called a one-child policy, which started back in 1980 when I was in China, and which involved telling everybody in China they can only have one child. Now, in many countries, that kind of policy would be literally unenforceable. But in China, the Communist Party actually maintains the muscular tone of the system by periodically carrying out political campaigns that intrude into people's lives and that teach the masses, one more time, that teach the masses that they must obey the party at all costs. Right now, we've got a campaign underway in China to control the coronavirus outbreak, the made-in-China coronavirus outbreak. And they're using the same police state tactics that they used to enforce the one-child policy, and that they used to carry out the Cultural Revolution, and that they used to carry out the anti-rightist political purges of the 60s and 70s, all the way back to the beginning of the People's Republic of China, the beginning of the Chinese Communist Party. In the case of the one-child policy, they simply went door to door. They identified all the women who were pregnant with second, third, fourth children and told them they must come in for abortions for the good of the country. Just like now, they're going door to door, and anybody who has a fever is actually either barricaded in their apartments or taken off to a detention center to be held. That gives quarantine a whole new sense about it, doesn't it? So, China, because of the one-child policy, which continued until 2016, it's now officially over. It is now the official policy of the Chinese government that you can have not one but two children. And guess what? A lot of the young people in China don't want to have even one child. Many of them don't want to marry at all. 2 generations of anti-natal propaganda have done their work. The Chinese government actually when it sent its population control police door to door, they were telling people that the only way to avert cannibalism is by embarking on a one-child policy. The only way to avert environmental collapse is to embark on a one-child policy. They were painting this dire picture of how bad things would be in China if the birth rate wasn't forced down. And they convinced a lot of people in China. They convinced a lot of young people in China who are now unwilling to marry and have children at all. So the two-child policy has been a failure. The birth rate in China is probably either the lowest in the world or the second lowest in the world right now. Singapore is probably at number one. They're averaging, every couple is averaging less than one child. I think the last numbers I saw were 0.97. That's the total fertility rate for a woman over her reproductive lifetime, less than one child. That's a recipe for demographic disaster. You're cutting the population in half each generation. China, I think, is about at 1.06, which is almost the same as Singapore. Again, that means you're cutting the population in half every generation. So China's population is now aging and dying more rapidly than any human population in human history because of the geniuses who run the Chinese Communist Party. They've eliminated, up until a few years ago they were bragging about this, they've eliminated 400 million people from their population. And you think about that. 400 million unborn children sacrificed because of the failed idea of overpopulation. See, this is not just an innocent idea. This is not just an innocent myth. This is a myth that kills people, that kills especially unborn children. And so many unborn children have been killed in China that China's population is now, this year, probably going to go into a decline. That is to say, there will be more deaths than births in China this year. And that decline will only accelerate in the future. Now, we know that China is in the grip of a coronavirus epidemic, one that was generated, I think, by the Chinese Communist Party through incompetence or evil or a combination of both. But China will never be the dominant country in the world, not because of the coronavirus epidemic, which will pass. It will never be the dominant country in the world because it has killed off its future literally by killing off 400 million of the most productive, enterprising, hardworking people on the planet, killing off the next two generations of Chinese who would have gone on to build China. They're gone. They're gone forever. And who's been killed in disproportionate numbers? Little girls. Little girls have been eliminated in huge numbers by infanticide, by sex-selective abortion. And that means that there are so few young women in China today that there are tens of millions of young men who will not be able to find brides and get married because their brides, the women they would have married, were killed in utero or after birth or left to abandoned by the side of the road and left to die. And so we see things like the following. In the far west of China, there's a population called the Uyghurs. They're a Turkish-speaking group, about 10 million of them. Many of the men have been locked up in concentration camps, which are called, cutely, vocational training schools. Let me assure you that I've never seen a vocational training school with watchtowers in the corner, armed guards with AK-47s and barbed wire along the top, and surveillance cameras in every nook and cranny of the concentration camp, including in the toilet stalls. So what to do with all the women left alone in Western Turkestan? Well, you have a shortage of women in the rest of China, don't you, because of the one-child policy. So one of the things they're doing in China is they're selling in batches of 100 young girls in China, between the young girls from Western Turkestan, the Uyghurs, in batches of 100 to factories on the east coast of China. So if you need workers, you can get young women from Western Turkestan. You have to order them in batches of 100, as I say, and you have to have your own separate dormitory for these young women from Uyghur-speaking women. But they come with their own police minders, and they bring their own chef. But they're not allowed out of the factory gates unless they're accompanied by the watchers, by the minders. And I can tell you what's going to happen to every one of those young women from Western Turkestan. They're going to wind up being forced into marriage to a Han Chinese in the rest of the country. Why? Because there's a huge shortage of women. This is modern-day slavery. So China has succeeded because of the mismanagement of the Chinese Communist Party, succeeded in compromising its future. But birth rates are falling not just in China, they're falling in other countries as well. Demographers tell us that the population of the world will never double again. Our long-term problem, China's long-term problem, our long-term problem, is not too many children, but too few children. We in the pro-life movement know what to do about that, don't we? Stopping abortion would be a good first step in many ways. But when the question of overpopulation and promoting abortion overseas comes up at certain political debates, the answer is always the same. The candidates on the left are promising that they will continue to promote abortions everywhere, that they will fund groups that perform abortions everywhere, including in the United States, but not just here, around the globe. And they will do it with U.S. tax dollars. And they will do it to save the planet from too many people. We have an election coming up. I don't want to sound like I'm doing any electioneering here, but we all need to understand that we now have a party of death in the United States, a party of abortion in the United States, and a party of life in the United States. The lines, I think, have never been clearer. Now, one of the excuses used by the left to justify promoting abortion around the world, and this is from Bernie Sanders, let me quote him. He said, we need to curb population growth because women in poor countries do not want to have large numbers of babies, but are being denied a choice in the matter. That's so wrong that I hardly know how to address the question. We at the Population Research Institute have actually surveyed women in developing countries, Nigeria, Kenya, Sierra Leone, South America. They say that they're having just about the number of children that they want. They all understand what to do if they didn't want more children. They want the children they have. But people like Bernie Sanders, people on the left in the United States, people in the grip of the myth of overpopulation, believe that these women should be denied a choice. These women should be told how many children to have or not to have. And because of that, they want to promote population control in these countries. But if you ask the women of Nigeria or of Kenya what they want, it turns out that what they want is not fewer children, but help in keeping the ones they have alive. We ask them to list their health care needs in our surveys, and we surveyed thousands of women. What do they put at the top? They list access to clean drinking water, primary health care, and help with infectious diseases as their top priorities. Abortion does not even make the list, neither does contraception or family planning or any one of the other code words that are used for abortion promoting around the world. So Bernie Sanders tries to frame the issue as a choice. I'm sure AOC would frame the issue as a choice too, but population control is about everything but giving women a choice. It's about denying women a choice. The problem for the left is they now hate humanity, and therefore they want to discourage people from having children. They believe that the presence of people themselves on the planet is a kind of plague. And the way to eliminate that plague is by population control. Their idea of paradise is the Garden of Eden, before the creation of Adam and Eve. You see, when we came on the scene, we spoiled everything for the other species. Of course, did Chinese women have a choice when they were dragged off by the population control police to the abortion clinics where they were given lethal injections into the abdomen to kill their unborn child? Or had their unborn children delivered by cesarean section and killed? Did Indonesian women have a choice when the police came, actually soldiers came, and escorted them in for sterilization if they had 2 children already? Did Peruvian women have a choice when government officials told them that if they wanted medical care for their children, that they would have to come in for a tubal ligation before any medical care would be provided? Of course not. Those are all real-world examples. The women of Peru, for example, are still trying to get justice for having been sterilized years ago. In a campaign that was funded with US dollars and that was managed by, if you can believe it, China's population control authorities, who were brought in by the United Nations Population Fund to Peru to oversee the sterilization campaign in Peru, because they were the technical specialists in how to carry out a sterilization campaign. Well, indeed they were. They had lots of experience, didn't they? After all, they'd sterilized hundreds of millions of women in their own country. What's a few 100,000 more in Peru? Population control is about using the power of the state, the coercive power of the state, to deny women the right to decide how many children they have. You know, leave it to a socialist to embrace this idea. So we have, again, a choice this year. Now, you know already that we're succeeding on many fronts in the United States in promoting a culture of life. We're succeeding on judicial appointments. You know, I would put on my glasses, but it makes me look like Chuck Schumer. You know, that guy who is reduced to incoherence on the steps of the U.S. Supreme Court. I mean, what? He's supposed to be legislating right in the U.S. Senate, which is a very serious, solemn, deliberative body. And instead we see him reduced to primal screams on the steps of the Supreme Court against Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. But we have a lot more work to be done. The Mexico City policy, for example, is the best policy we've ever had. Now, I was involved in the original Mexico City policy back in the mid-'80s after coming back from China. And we got a pretty good policy in place under President Reagan. And the policy at the time, however, only applied to the population control global family planning budget of about $1 billion. The Mexico City policy we have in place now applies to about $10 billion, because it applies to almost all spending of the federal government, monies that go overseas. But it's not perfect. And it's not perfect because we have not been able to, thanks to Nancy Pelosi and her control over the House of Representatives, we have not been able to make the Mexico City policy, which forbids U.S. funds from going to any group that promotes, performs, or lobbies for the legalization of abortion. We've not been able to apply that to U.S.-based groups. It applies to foreign groups, and it's been applied very successfully there. But U.S.-based groups are still getting money. We all know Planned Parenthood is still being funded. That's something we have to solve. It also doesn't, the current Mexico City policy also doesn't block all U.S. government funding overseas. We've just been fighting a battle in Colombia, the South American country of Colombia, against a Planned Parenthood affiliate called Pro Familia. I'll let you think about the cynicism embedded in that name for a minute. They're Pro Familia, right? What do? They abort children. They're very pro-family. They're still getting, Pro Familia is still getting a health grant from Health and Human Services because they claim they're involved in projects that are promoting the health of women and children. This money shouldn't be going to a group that kills babies, you know. The abortion is very unhealthy for babies, obviously. So we need to close these loopholes. We won't be able to do it unless we have a pro-life majority in the House of Representatives. We need to defund Planned Parenthood. We won't be able to do that unless we have a pro-life majority in the House of Representatives. We need about 200 more federal judges and at least one, hopefully 2 more Supreme Court justices. We need Roe versus Wade overturned once and for all. Gone. So you all know what we need to do to accomplish this. We need a pro-life House, we need a pro-life Senate, and we need a pro-life president. The good news is we already have a pro-life president. The bad news is the water in the swamp in Washington, D.C. is still about hip deep, and the battle goes on every day. The man has a titanium spine, I will tell you. He is in the trenches every day being subjected to attacks that would have sent a lesser man into early retirement. But he carries on, and we need to get behind this administration and this president because this opportunity will not come again in our lifetimes. I've been waiting since I joined the pro-life movement back in the early 80s after coming back from the People's Republic of China and seeing for myself with my own eyes what an abortion really was. I've been waiting for a moment when we had a pro-life House, a pro-life Senate, a pro-life Supreme Court, a pro-life president, to do all of the things we need to do to protect unborn children from conception and to protect the elderly. We now have an opportunity to do that. We didn't under Reagan, because he had the Senate, but he didn't have the House of Representatives. We obviously had no chance under the 2 pro-abortion presidents. So this is a generational opportunity. This is an opportunity that will not come again for another generation, may never come again. This is our time. This is our moment. We have to do this. We have to succeed. And just one more point on the whole myth of overpopulation, which is still used by the left to justify forcing abortion on women around the world. I believe that at the beginning of time, that God created a planet, the planet Earth, with the resources that we would need as our numbers grew. And that, of course, has been the whole history of our existence on the planet. As our numbers have grown, as our needs have grown, we have used our God-given creative intelligence to unlock resources that past generations had no idea even existed. Who would have thought 200 years ago that we would be taking silica from sand on the beaches and use it to make electronic equipment that we can use to communicate instantaneously around the world? So, we know, of course, because the demographers have told us that there's no overpopulation problem on planet Earth, and there's likely never to be. Our long-term problem is not going to be too many people, it's going to be too few people. And we know there's no overpopulation problem in heaven either, don't we? because our Lord has assured us that there are many mansions in our Father's house, and it's our job as pro-lifers to fill them. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So, I don't know if we have time for questions.
Absolutely. We're
All
good.
right.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We've got questions. They're just coming in here. This good stuff here. All right, so let's start with this one. I can read nice, clear writing. Thank you for that. That's kind. With the data we have on extreme drops in the birth rate in so many countries, what is behind the continued promulgation of overpopulation? Is it lies? Also, and who is funding this? Who's benefiting?
Well, the overpopulation movement has been picking the public purse now for over 50 years. The hysteria over overpopulation began in the 1960s. And the United States, actually our country, was behind setting up the UN Population Fund in 1968 for the purpose of combating overpopulation. And the federal funds began to flow. They come from not just the United States, they come from other countries, Japan and Germany and the Scandinavian countries, and also from the wealthy billionaires in our country, the Bill Gates and the Warren Buffetts, all seem to believe that there are too many poor people around. Of course, by their standards, we're all poor. And so they fund the population control effort as well. So there's a lot of public and private money that goes into this movement. And the sad fact is that movements with billions of dollars at their disposal and thousands of people who make a living off that, the myth of overpopulation, do not quietly go to their graves. They seek to perpetuate themselves. They seek to perpetuate their myth. The numbers don't lie. If we were a rational society, if we believed in facts, which reminds me of my old friend Senator Joe Biden, who once said, we believe in truth, not facts. And I thought to myself, you know, the truth he's speaking of is not objective truth. The truth he's speaking of is ideological truth. Are the things that they believe, like the myth of overpopulation, that they hold true as a revealed truth, but they're not, of course, and they completely ignore the facts. You're looking at your watch.
We're doing good. We got good 10 minutes.
Okay.
You're good, bud.
So I was on the commission that set up Radio Free Asia back in the early 90s, and Senator Joe Biden was a great supporter of Radio Free Asia, broadcasting news and information into China about human rights abuses there. But he did ask us how much it would cost. And I said, well, Senator, we estimate it'll cost about $25 million. And he just laughed, and he said in one of those Biden-esque statements that we all know and love, he said, we don't pay any attention to anything to the right of the decimal point. What decimal point was he talking about? The decimal point between 1 billion and 999 million. This is in the 1990s. Today, I don't even think he knows their decimal points. I mean, anyway, I don't want to be unkind. But so the movement, the anti-people movement goes on and on. And you know, when I say to people who believe that we need to be reducing the number of people on the planet, 2 words: you first.
Oh, that's good. That's good. We got lots of time. We're doing good. Oh, I like a good comeback. That's good. Hey, from 2016 to 2018, we had majority control. Why do you think gaining control again will mean we will actually defund Planned Parenthood? That's a why question. Okay.
Yeah,
not a how. How can we defund, but no, why?
Well, that's a good question, and there are some people I know who come to mind, but I don't want to get I don't want to get personal. There was a lack of energy in the House and the Senate on some of these critical issues in those years. And of course, there was a lot of undermining going on within the administration itself. There were a lot of people in key positions throughout the administration who were actively working against the president's policies. So he came into office as an outsider. It, I think, takes a while to understand how things work and to get the right people in place. And I think we're there now in terms of the administration. We have the most pro-life cabinet in history. And we also have in the number 2 and number 3 positions, we have people who are solidly pro-life. So now we just need to stiffen the spine of the people in the Senate and the House to act on what they tell us they believe in. You know, it's not enough for them to be out in the campaign trail and say they're pro-life. They actually have to risk some political capital to push these issues when they get back to the Senate and the House. And I will tell you, in the House of Representatives, there are a couple hundred members of the pro-life caucus, but the members who would actually lay down in the road and die for the babies politically, probably a couple dozen. So we need to, it wouldn't hurt to have a supermajority to get the ones in the middle off the fence.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. And last one before our break, and again, some of the questions will be addressed with Molly and her radio show coming up, but in terms of the elections, a lot of the folks, even in my church and as I travel, they're not one-issue voters. Where do you see that? How important should this be in terms of voting? If I'm making a choice, do we look at economy? Do we look at other issues? Or is it strictly pro-life or nothing?
Well, I was in the operating room when women 7, 8, 9 months pregnant were being forcibly aborted by a cesarean section. And I went into the operating room. I'd never really thought about the issue. I thought of it as a woman's issue exclusively. But I went into that operating room probably leaning towards a kind of pro-choice position. I came out of the operating room as thoroughly pro-choice, thoroughly pro-life. And I've never looked back. I mean, for me, that's the paramount issue. I think that was the paramount issue for our founding fathers as well. It was a paramount issue for our founding fathers as well. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life comes first. Without life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness become meaningless, don't they? So the life issue is paramount. You know, if your house is on fire, then you're not up on the 4th floor rearranging the furniture, right? You're putting out the fire. The fire is the death of hundreds of thousands of unborn Americans each year. We've got to put out the fire, and then we can worry about rearranging the furniture.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you, Steve. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
You go ahead.